Hello and welcome to our webinar on cybersecurity and the election. My name is Lynn Schofield Clark, and I'm a professor at the University of Denver in the area of journalism and media studies. And I'm also the director of the ESLO Center, which is the Center for Journalism and New Media at the University of Denver. And I'm pleased to be able to be your moderator today. We have a wonderful group of people who will be participating and sharing some of their expertise with you, but also we want to encourage you as an audience member to feel free to talk with us as well about some of the things that you're interested in and are curious about. As we get started, as a person who teaches in the journalism area, I wanted to take a step back to frame our conversation because cybersecurity isn't something that is a part of everyday conversation for a lot of us. A few years ago, I confess that I probably would have thought of cybersecurity in relation to things like credit card fraud. And maybe you too have received a notice that the data associated with your account has been compromised and that the company is doing all they can to close a breach and guarantee that it's safe for you to trust them again with private financial records. And now, of course, we're also concerned about the security of the upcoming election, in part because a lot of us realize that we were never really sure what happens after our ballot is either entered into the mail or put into a ballot box or filled out at a polling center. Do we trust the technology that is supposed to count the ballots? Do we trust the post office that these will be delivered? What we have in 2020 is a lot of uncertainty. And we know now that Russia wanted to benefit from US uncertainty in the 2016 elections. The goal of the Russian interference in the 2016 election, as determined by the US intelligence community and as detailed in the Mueller report, was to damage the Clinton campaign, boost Trump's chances, and perhaps most centrally, to increase distrust in the US systems of democratic governance. So that is what uncertainty does. It increases distrust. We know about things today like the Russian troll farms and bots, which are technologies that are leveraged through artificial intelligence to do things like put messages out on Twitter or in Facebook that will fan the flames of conflict and increase uncertainty and chaos and contribute to polarization. And we know that we're still struggling to figure out how or whether to regulate misinformation in places like Facebook, which only 3 days ago said it would ban posts that deny or distort the Holocaust, something that Twitter just struggling to decide regulation, information, and technology. Social media as well as more primary attacks, which makes security a challenging field. It involves technological solutions, interpretation of communication messages, and human behaviors. So cybersecurity as a field then is being asked to address the problems of human uncertainty and doubt. Fortunately, cybersecurity is not the only field that's doing this, but it's obviously one with a key role to play. And so here now we're facing another election and we're all wondering, what did we learn from the 2016 election in relation to cybersecurity? What are we doing differently this year to prevent manipulation? And what are the warning signs that we should be watching for? And what should we as citizens be doing when we see them? And finally, what is the role of those with technological expertise in trying to address these problems for us? Here at the University of Denver, we're committed to bringing programs to our community that are relevant and timely and then invite civil discourse. And we need to understand, we need people today in our field and in our society who can develop technologies and processes and practices that can understand and help us to stop attempts that would attack our networks, our devices, our programs, or our data. And we need experts in related fields, like in the field of journalism, to help us understand how humans respond when technological tools are leveraged to flood people with seeming news stories that contain untruths, for example, like yesterday's New York Post story that circulated widely on Twitter and then was sanctioned and has been debunked by the Washington Post this morning. As a university, we want to leverage the traditions of critical and historical analysis to both help us better understand the present and to prepare for and give shape to the future that we all want together. And so this discussion that is part of the Policy Perspectives series is intended to encourage civil engagement and education and provide helpful resources, as well as offer balanced perspectives in what is often a complex political system. So for today's conversation, we have a representation from a wide variety of perspectives, including a graduate student who is researching the area, faculty from our Media, Film, and Journalism Studies department, and from our Engineering and Computer Science department. And we also have on our panel an alumnus who is an expert in the field and a representative from the Colorado Department of State. So before we begin our introductions, I want to encourage our audience to participate, as I mentioned earlier. And so if you have any questions for the panelists, we'd like to encourage you to use the question and answer box, the Q&A box that'll be at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side, to submit any questions. And we'll attempt to answer all the questions that are submitted. And in addition, you're also welcome to use the chat function to introduce yourself and let us know where you're located today. This is an opportunity for you, if you're an alumnus, to please be in touch with one another and help us to know that you're here as well. And all the questions in the panel, again, just please remember to submit those through the Q&A box. And so now first, to gain a sense of understanding of the topic among our audience, we're going to launch a poll. And you should see a question pop up soon on your screen. And we're going to ask you to take a moment to share with us your familiarity with cybersecurity issues from 2016 and from the current election cycle. And we'll be sharing those results with you in just a moment. Okay, and we'll take a second to see the poll results. We'll be seeing the poll results, I think, in just a few seconds here. So thank you for giving your response. And oh, there we go. So it looks like most of our audience would rank themselves as somewhat familiar, and very closely followed by very familiar with some of the cybersecurity issues and concerns related to 2016 and the concerns for the current election. And then we have just a few on the outer ends, both not familiar or an expert at the issue. So I'm going to take a moment now to quickly introduce our panelists. Our first is Dan Pittman, who is an associate professor of the practice in software development and architecture in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Denver. He worked in the software industry for 13 years, most recently as a principal software architect. Cassia Antone received her BA in Applied Computing from DA's Ritchie School of Engineering and Computer Science and minored in History and Public Policy. She's currently pursuing her master's in Computer Science. Vincent Szilagyi is a political consultant and strategist specializing in campaign strategies, logistics, data analysis, and effective political problem solving. He's the owner and partner at Saratoga Strategies, a Denver-based political consulting firm focused on center and right-of-center politics. Szilagyi is a graduate of the University of Denver, where he majored in history, political science, and geography. David Capini is an assistant professor in the Department of Media, Film, and Journalism Studies. His research focuses on the role that media messages and platforms play in shaping political attitudes and behaviors, and he also explores the ways of reducing stereotypes in political and in health contexts. Trevor Timmons has served as Chief Information Officer to the Colorado Secretary of State since 2007, and before that he served for 8 years as Deputy CIO and Director of Software Development. During Mr. Timmons' tenure working under several secretaries of state, Colorado has gained national recognition for its leadership in several areas, including elections administration, business registrations, and cybersecurity operations. So we'll start off by asking some direct questions to each of the panelists in the areas of their research and expertise, but we welcome the panelists to jump in if they have additional comments that they'd like to add, or if they'd like to share a perspective of their own on any of the questions. And then again, we would also like to ask you as a member of the audience to please feel free to share your questions and answers in the box below, and we'll be integrating those and returning to those in just a minute. So the first question I have is for Dan. Dan is someone who has actively worked in and studied in the area of software and technology. Can you tell us a little bit about the cybersecurity concerns that you have going into the 2020 election?
Hi, thanks for the introduction. So yeah, when I was researching the issues around the upcoming election, it was kind of interesting because there's these traditional problems we think about related to, hacking voting machines or manipulating the outcome of election. And certainly those are concerns that are interesting to talk about. But honestly, when you look at 2016 and now coming into 2020, you don't need to actually manipulate the outcome of an election to win. You just have to make people think you did. right? If we can sow distrust in the system and make people not trust the outcomes of elections through misinformation or through phishing campaigns that can take advantage of the security that's put in place for local polling officials and lock out their machines during election night. Things like that can make people distrust the system, and then taken further, distrust the outcome of the election, right? So you can win without actually affecting the outcome of the election if you're an adversary trying to impact us. So, there's a couple of ways that this can take place, either misinformation campaign over social media, which some of my fellow panelists, I think, would be able to speak to that really well, about how social media can play a huge part in that, how the media can present information related on social media and without validating it thoroughly first, maybe for instance, and cause some issues there. But there's also on election night itself, we have local election officials, volunteers, for instance, that maybe aren't taking good precautions for their security on their laptops, or things like that. And maybe they're turning in intermediate polling data, exit polling data. Maybe they're letting local party officials know how things are going, maybe things of that nature, right? And if you can take advantage of their lax security posture and take over their machines and lock out information on election night, for instance, make people think that a red county went blue or a blue county went red, even though the polling isn't official, even though that kind of data isn't record, and the certification of the ballots will still go normally and the election will get called correctly. If people see that, they distrust the certified result of the election, right? And so that is something I think is a real challenge that we should address. And the good thing about that is it's fixable, right? And it's fixable through education. Things like this webinar, getting information out there about the facts on the ground. Like we'll talk about how Colorado's approaching how it certifies its ballots, right? And how that's going to be approached. We can inform the public, right? And that's with, with this webinar, for instance. When, local election officials, we can help them, right? There's this kind of report I was looking at that was talking about election officials using private email addresses or not using multi-factor authentication, right? Doing simple things that can, or, being aware of phishing campaigns, know what to look for, putting security controls in place administratively to prevent phishing attacks from taking place, so that you can't do ransomware against their laptops or take over their accounts and send false data out, right? These are things that can be solved through education and better practices. We already have the tools to fix it. So to me, that's what I'm most concerned about, I guess I should say, going to the election. And I think it's something we can absolutely help solve.
Thank you, Dan. I think that's really a great point of how important it is that we have education, that we have opportunities like this to try to sort out what we know and don't know, and that we can learn some really basic things about things like phishing. And so I think one of the things I'd like to hear is if we could talk with Cassia. You were present during the Iowa caucus in February 2020. And I'm wondering, I know that you had some instances where you were talking about these kinds of things as well and doing some research on this. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you learned from that experience.
No, actually, this is actually a good lead into Cassia, so I hope you were doing that, because Cassia was the one that was there. Okay, great. Because I think
that's what I was hoping that Cassia would be able to.
Okay, I want to make sure you said that. All right,
yeah, we'll come back to you to talk a little bit about some of these other things too.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. To start off here, I thought I'd provide a little bit of background information about the Iowa caucus, just so we're all on the same page here. For those who aren't aware, a caucus is a meeting at a specific time and place of party members of a specific area, usually around the neighborhood level. In Iowa, a majority of these caucuses start at 7 p.m. on February 3rd of 2020. After the caucus, those running each caucus site would need to report the number of delegates awarded from each precinct for each presidential candidate, as well as the vote totals for each round of the caucus. There are various rounds of voting that determine which candidates are considered viable moving forward. Without getting into too much detail, this usually results in a contested caucus like we had in 2020, and most candidates leaving with 1 or 2 delegates from each caucus site. This reporting was supposed to be done via a mobile app that would send data directly to the Iowa Democratic Party, and this was done with the intent of allowing for more quickly and accurate data reporting results. One thing that the Iowa Democratic Party was intentionally trying to avoid was the reputation of the Iowa caucuses, where results tend to be slow and often riddled with errors. For example, with the 2012 Iowa Republican caucus night, the election was called for Mitt Romney fairly late in the evening, but after the results were verified a few weeks later, it was later found out that Rick Santorum ended up with a slight edge in state delegate totals and was later declared the winner of those caucuses. The Iowa Democratic Party had this event in mind and was actively trying to avoid this with their 2020 caucuses. Now, when we get to the night of the caucus, prior to the night of, many caucus organizers were having issues downloading and logging into the mobile app. This mobile app was not uploaded through the traditional App Store or Google Play Store, respectively, for different smartphone platforms, but had to be sideloaded, leading many caucus organizers to be concerned as their phone would tell them, hey, it's unsafe to download apps from non-App Store places, leading many to just decide to use the backup phone number that was meant for reporting data on caucus night. When it did come time to report the results, the few that were able to get the results reported through the app were noticing rather many issues. The app was, when the results began to be published, incorrect data was being showed. You had several caucus chairs and county Democratic Party heads that were being like, these results are not correct, here's what the results actually are, which led shortly after to the Iowa Democratic Party pulling the results from online and weren't made available until much later after the night of. What is believed to have gone wrong with the app was that after the caucus took place, several independent cybersecurity experts were given access to the app to try and determine what went wrong. The app was shown to be rather technically flawed, seemed to be rather rushed, suffered many security issues, and wasn't even stress tested. It wasn't designed under the assumption that everyone would need to use the app for reporting would be doing so in the same 1 to 2 hour window around 9 to 10 p.m. on caucus night, as well as further issues down the line where the backup phone number that was used to report the results had been posted publicly online several weeks in advance of the caucus, leading to not only every caucus organizer in the state trying to call this phone number at once, but many journalists attempting to get more information about when results would be available, and a number of prank callers calling the line in an effort to disrupt the process. And just from here, there are a few obvious areas of improvement that can be done in the future. First things first, the biggest one is just simply test your app. By all metrics that have been shown, this app was not tested at all. It didn't really have any sort of stress test implemented, leading many to looking back on it to be like, of course this failed. It was set up to do so. Another big question was just properly vetting who is making your app. The company Shadow Inc., who has developed the app used in the Iowa caucuses, had never developed an election reporting system prior. The company had worked on several other software programs for various other campaigns, most notably for Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign, which later led many to call into question the unbiasedness of the results, but not really much evidence stands to benefit this term. Another interesting note here is that the Joe Biden campaign was also working with Shadow Inc., but pulled out their contract with them due to cybersecurity concerns, a move that in retrospect seems like a rather good decision. And finally, most importantly here is making sure your backup system is functional. Had the backup system functioned properly, I probably wouldn't be here talking to this right now. It probably would be maybe a footnote on the Wikipedia page about the 2020 Iowa caucuses. But in previous years, an automated phone system had been used for reporting results. This was replaced in 2020 with a small group of volunteers who were to manually gather results from those calling in, which, as somebody who was following the Iowa caucuses, it's fairly clear to know was everybody. And just the security concerns with the phone number being shared publicly also led to further issues down the line.
So is this something that is sort of something that we may be looking for when we're thinking about the election as it unfolds on election night? We're already hearing that we really won't be able to trust the results that come out immediately because of all kinds of issues related to counting and various rules, basically, by the state. So is that something that you're trying to look into as well, kind of looking for hot spots in terms of what states may be developing apps and looking into this, looking into some of the areas where we are more likely than other areas to have problems?
With regards to the upcoming general election, this isn't really a huge concern as the app was designed for specifically the caucuses where these counts are being done by hand by volunteers in the room with a proper election machine where there are paper ballots present. The submitting results systems should be a lot more secure than what it was being used for the caucus.
Great. Well, thank you, Cassia, for your research and for working on this. I think that, and I'm sure we'll come back to you with some more things that, that relate to what you've been looking at and what you can tell us. And I wanted to turn now to David because we started one of the things that both Cassia and Dan before Cassia have talked about is the ways that mistrust is kind of playing a role in what we're seeing, and how even the question of whether or not we can trust what we're receiving, in part because there are some technical difficulties, as Cassie was mentioning in the particular case of the Iowa caucuses, but there are issues of technical flaws and security issues that then can become leveraged and also can be a form of misinformation, or can be places where misinformation can be entered into, particularly through social media tactics like phishing. And so David, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the ways that the news media and social media have played a role in the spread of misinformation. If you have some particular examples or some things that you're seeing in relation to how misinformation is being spread and how these technological platforms are playing a role in this, sometimes not even with their knowledge.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Lynn, for the introduction. We know that even if misinformation has always existed, thanks to social media, it spreads much faster and more effectively. And we saw that in 2016 with some false stories that received a higher level of engagement compared to legitimate news stories. For example, I remember made-up stories about Pope Francis endorsing candidate Trump at the time, or the stories related to the infamous Pizzagate conspiracy theory in 2016. And we have seen that in this campaign, misinformation spreading about the pandemic, the legitimacy of voting via mail, and voter fraud more generally. And there are a few reasons why misinformation spreads so fast on social media. First, misinformation stories tend to get the attention of people because they're often written in a way that is clickbaiting, right? They're designed to get people's attention with catchy titles, and they play with people's emotions and political beliefs. And we saw that in the type of stories that were pushed by Russian entities in 2016, which tried to exploit political disagreement and conflict in American politics. In addition to that, on social media, on social networks, like in all of our communities, we see mechanisms of social influence and social trust at play, right? Many people are more likely to be influenced by their peers, by people they know. And so when they see someone posting something on social media, they often trust these individuals more than experts and politicians because they're people that they know in their community. And third, misinformation is amplified on social media. You can reach thousands, if not millions of people very quickly. And until recently, there wasn't really a check on how many people you could share a story with, or a system in place, so you could check the veracity of a story and whether a story was true or not. And we know that, different demographics are influenced in different ways by misinformation. For example, we have seen studies that show that seniors in particular, people over 65, are more prone to be exposed and influenced by misinformation than they see on social media. And there is also some data that point out that people with lower level of education could be more influenced by misinformation campaigns. And so obviously, misinformation can have consequences on attitudes, political attitudes and behaviors. And there is a lot of evidence that exposure to misinformation can have effects, especially when it comes to public health issues, like the current pandemic, and issues where there is a strong, where the public is polarized, for example, climate change. And there was a study from Reuters that showed that misinformation can help increase distrust in traditional forms on news media as well. When it comes to what happened in 2016, we know that there was a misinformation campaign orchestrated by Russian entities. We don't know the extent to which it moved a significant amount of votes. And, that's something that we still need more research on. We know that definitely that campaign was able to create chaos and so discord in the American public. And we are seeing now some misleading claims on voting and the electoral process that have spread quickly on social media and could definitely reinforce, could definitely create problems in terms of distrust in the process and undermining trust in the American democracy. And I can also talk about some of the things that social media networks are doing in terms of trying to curb misinformation. We have seen that, for example, both Twitter and Facebook have partnered with health authorities.
Hi there. I think David is frozen at the moment, so we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. So we're going to see if we can have him come back in. David was just talking a little bit about the issue of how important social media is in this issue of vetting information, because I think we have traditionally relied on mainstream media, especially news media, to be in charge of helping us to think about information systems and to make sure that information is verified before it's circulated widely. And in the social media era, we don't necessarily have those kinds of checks and balances that we once had. And so we're relying on each other, and things can spread very quickly, especially if they have some kind of a way that if there is some aspect of the information that seems like it has a kernel of truth in it. It's much easier to spread information if there's already something that is present that then can be amplified and twisted just a little bit, or that it plays on some way in which people want to believe that things are working out. So I think that what David's point was, I think when we lost it, unfortunately, is about how much it's possible for misinformation then to contribute to this issue of chaos and distrust, and then that can influence not necessarily how people vote, but it may influence whether people trust the voting system, or whether they even trust in whether or not they can trust any officials. And so this is a really good transition then, I think, to Vincent, who is somebody who has experience working on local campaign efforts. And I'm wondering, Vincent, if you could talk a little bit about the local level and how misinformation then influences policy, but also, or influences polling, I was going to say, specifically in terms of public views on these a variety of issues. But specifically, I wondered if you could step back and talk a little bit about polling, how polling is used in different campaigns, specifically how there might be problems in how polls are conducted, and how then we think about polling in relation to, actually representing what people think and how they might vote.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Polling is used an awful lot and has an outsized role in local campaigns simply because there just isn't as much of it. You think of how many polls Cory Gardner and John Hickenlooper have gotten, which is a lot, but it's significantly less than you'd see for Trump or Biden or anything like that. So we have fewer polls to work with to begin with, which means that each poll matters more. And also the bigger problem we have with polling on a local level is that you get what you pay for. And frankly, a lot of people will go cheap. Polling, the biggest fundamental problem we have with polling, and part of the reason why a lot of people were very surprised by what happened in 2016, is something called the shy Tory effect. Now, the shy Tory effect is something that originally was present in British politics from about the 1960s onwards. Very, very briefly, Britain has basically 2 or 3 major parties. One of them is called the Conservative Party, and their nickname is the Tories. And what they were finding in public polling is that for some reason, the electoral results for Tories tended to be significantly higher than the polling results for Tories, sometimes as much as 5, 10, even 15% in a few elections. And what they began to realize was it wasn't so much a problem with the sampling of the polling, it was that people were lying to pollsters. They were telling them that, oh, well, I'm going to go support Labour or the Lib Dems or somebody, but would actually cast their vote for the Conservative candidate, for the Tories. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for that in the British context, and we can get into that in a different webinar. But for the American context, it's a good analog for what happened in 2016, particularly in the later half of the election, certainly post Donald Trump winning the nomination for the Republican Party, but significantly increased after the Access Hollywood tape came out. At that point, you saw all sorts of Republicans, even elected officials like Senator Cory Gardner and a bunch of other senators and representatives and former presidential candidates say, well, I'm no longer going to support Donald Trump. Now, the question is how many people lied to pollsters in the first place saying, oh yeah, I'm going to support Donald Trump and I'm embarrassed to talk to you about it. Or the bigger question of, are the polls asking the right questions to the right people? Sampling bias in polling is something that we've been trying to alleviate for a while. The way we normally do that is, let's say you have a poll that talks to 100 people and afterwards you find out 90% of them are white, but the previous election only had 70% of white turnout. You would then decrease the answers from white people in that survey and increase everyone else. The problem with that is sort of twofold. One, it assumes that people who voted in the last election are going to be likely to vote in the next election. So people who didn't vote are the ones who are going to be left out of that. And secondly, people often lie to pollsters about how likely they are to vote in the first place. So you have pretty much everyone who answers the poll is going to say, oh yeah, I'm super likely to vote or very likely to vote or somewhat likely. But our voting turnout rates show that that's really not true. I mean, good turnout for Americans in the 60s, and that's unlikely to happen in the polls. Most polls say that 80% of people are going to vote. The greater problem, and this is the thing that keeps most pollsters up at night, is the fact that they may have a self-selection bias in people who are willing to answer polls at all. I don't know how many people here answer calls from unknown numbers and are willing to take 15-minute surveys. I don't do it very often. Most of them go straight to spam risk. So you're getting a group of people who are significantly less likely than the average person to vote and also more likely to talk to random people on the phone. That means you get a lot more people from landlines, a lot of more elderly voters. And because of the sampling we have, you get people who, let's say they represent a demographic that's usually only 5 or 10% of the electorate, but because of the sampling in the poll, they represent 20%. You can get some really skewed results very, very quickly. And that's part of the reason why people got so surprised in 2016 is because they viewed polls as being indicative of something greater than like, okay, we talked to 1,000 people this one time. And I'm sure if we can get David back, he will speak to some of the problems of reporting and polling. But the elements of polling itself, such as a margin of error, are generally not understood by most people and certainly not reported in the media. Very briefly, for instance, if we have a poll that says, Joe Biden is up by 2% and the margin of error of the poll is 5%, the poll has told you scientifically absolutely nothing. That we believe that there's 95% confidence that Joe Biden is somewhere between being up by 3 points or losing by 8 points. But the media reports Joe Biden ahead, and then everyone takes that. And there's some argument that people have been discouraged by polls, particularly if they're in close states and they say, oh, well, my candidate's going to win, so I don't really need to turn out. But there's also argument to the opposite that, oh, my candidate is down, so my vote matters that much more.
Right, yeah.
And really the last
perception is, I think, yeah.
Yeah, the last thing I'd like to mention on polling is that we have kind of a sports focus on polling where we treat it like a horse race.
Exactly, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. Elections are singular term events. There's going to be one election in Colorado to determine who our presidential election is going to go to. No one is ahead or behind. No one is winning or losing. It happens one time, one thing. You're asking people to predict what they're going to do in the future. And like most predictions of the future, it's not worth a whole hell of a lot. It can tell you some things in the aggregate. For instance, if every poll has, like they do now, Joe Biden up by somewhere between 5 to 14 points, that's generally a pretty good indication that despite all the individual problems within specific polls, if all the polls are telling you something in generally the same direction, you can generally assume that, for instance, Joe Biden is probably ahead at the moment. But we will find out in 2 weeks or probably 2 months when all the elections are over and all the votes are counted.
Yep. Well, thank you, Vince. I think that's right. There is a lot of uncertainty, and we know some things about the fact that weather will make a difference, or how long people have to wait in line for the polling. Those kinds of things also contribute to what we're actually going to see, I suppose, on election day, and whether or not, and what we will actually know by then. So it is interesting to kind of to put the polling in perspective. And I think that definitely after 2016, we have a lot more concern about how much to place our trust in polls, but yet I appreciate your help in kind of helping us to recognize that there is value in them still, even though they may not be as accurate as we once had hoped they would be. And so I think that also raises the question then about what what can we trust in terms of how the state is doing? And I guess I've raised this a couple of times, just in the issue of, what happens when we're not sure if people will actually be able to get to the polling places. Some we know that there are some places that have fewer polling places around the country than they did at one time, or that there are many stories about the post office and delivery and how long different states have to count the votes. So I'm wondering if you could, I'm going to turn things to Trevor, who has worked for quite a while with the Colorado Secretary of State. And one of your roles, I think, professionally, Trevor, has really been to reassure the public in some ways that the election process itself, as it's taking place in Colorado, is something that we can count on. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's being done at the state government level to make this a secure and a seamless process.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. So I'll start right off the bat and say that in Colorado, we have a heavy reliance on the paper ballot, right? We mail ballots to every active registered voter. You probably already have your ballot sitting on your kitchen table. So we place heavy reliance on the paper. I'm actually going to come back to that because there are some systems that are network connected where there is risk, as there's risk in any machine that's actually connected to a network, right? In the elections space, we do everything that you would normally do with anything that's network connected. Vulnerability scanning, regular patching. We partner with organizations like the Department of Homeland Security, their Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We partner with the FBI. We partner with state and local resources, other resources, so we can monitor and defend those network connected systems, like a voter registration system. Many states have the ability for voters to check their registration to make sure that the registration authority has your address, so your ballot's going to end up in the right spot. We also allow people to track the status of the mail ballot as it's on its way to the voter and then as it's coming back to the official election office. And so we provide those kinds of online resources, but that does mean that those online systems are subject to risk, right? Which is why we track vulnerabilities. We regularly patch and update. We do other things in Colorado. Every election judge throughout the state, we use multi-factor authentication. So it's not login and password that could be sent and found, in some data breach. We actually require multi-factor authentication. That's largely becoming a best practice across the union, which is fantastic. In the middle part of the process, those voting machines, if you choose to go in and vote in person, which in Colorado you absolutely can, you can use a ballot marking device, or you can walk in and request a mail ballot, a paper ballot to mark. Those systems are not networked, right? There are still risks to those systems, but the universe of potential exploits are somewhat smaller, obviously, than if they were actually network connected. That's terrific. We think that's a best practice as well. And then at the end of the process, we spoke about election night reporting of results. Those results, probably everybody recognizes, those are unofficial results. The information you see on election night has not actually been vetted, down to the ballot level by those election officials. At the local level here in Colorado, each of our 64 county clerks, they're the ones that actually make sure all those ballots are tabulated. They have public meetings to establish the canvas of votes to verify that they can certify the results at the end of an election. And in Colorado, we even go one level better. There's a particular form of post-election audits. They're called risk limiting audits, okay? It's based on some fabulous math, some statistical analysis. The initial theories were put together by Philip Stark from Berkeley, Mark Lindemann from Columbia University, and Ron Rivest from MIT. It's really a way of kind of eliminating reliance on trusting machines to make sure that the outcomes of results are correct. Colorado is the first state in the country that has been doing this as a mandatory statewide activity after every single election. This is also, it's considered today, a best practice really to remove that reliance on machines, because it really does achieve software independence. We have bipartisan teams of judges that look at the individual paper ballots that were marked by human beings, and they compare that to the computer-generated scanning interpretation of those marks. So you've got an R and a D and an election official who are looking at this so they can resolve those discrepancies right there, comparing the paper versus what the computer told them. It eliminates the need for us to trust the machine. We're always going back to the paper. It's been a trend nationally that we see, and I think it's taken hold. Rhode Island is doing risk limiting audits now. Other states are moving forward on that, and some of those Colorado election officials have now been moving out. They're working with organizations like the Democracy Fund. They're doing consulting work with CISA and the U.S. Election Assistance Committee so that they can actually take that knowledge and that wisdom and kind of move that out throughout the country.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Dan. And I think that, Trevor, I think we have such great leadership here in Colorado. So I just want to thank you for the work that you've done. It's exciting to see. I was just checking on Twitter that Jenna Griswold's office had noted that we're up, I think, 24% in Colorado in terms of the number of votes that have been turned in early already. And most of us have only received our ballots on Friday or Saturday. So I think it is a real testament to the work that's being done in the state to try to make sure that people have the right and the access to vote. And there's a question then that has come up among the panelists, I guess, from Vina Wolf-Kule. Sorry if I've mispronounced that. And I want to raise this question because I think it's a good follow-up to what Trevor was just saying. She asks, why do you think that we have not updated our voting procedures, especially in this technology arena? When, for example, a person could simply log in with a secure password and/or DL number to make it a much more simple and fair process. And so this is a really good question. And I think maybe what I'll do is turn to Vince first, since he has some areas of expertise on this. And then maybe we can also, if Trevor would like to weigh in, and also perhaps Dan, who wants to talk a little bit about the electronic voting question. So first, if we could hear Vincent, what's your experience with this?
So I'll let Dan and Trevor handle all the technical and logistical elements, which are much more their wheelhouse than mine. But the complicated nature of our system is actually an advantage in a lot of ways. We don't have, for instance, one national popular vote. By having the Electoral College, what we have is 51 separate state elections. And in Colorado, we don't have one state election. We have 64 individual county clerks that are certifying ballots. And we have a mix of people who are voting in person, people who are voting on paper ballots, out-of-state ballots, absentee ballots, things like that. So while that does make it very complicated and make counting it a very difficult thing, it also means that it's very difficult to hack. You don't just have to get through one system. You don't just have to change one paper trail. You don't just have to get into one voting machine. You have to fundamentally rely on your ability as a nefarious actor to influence all of these different levels. And as Trevor mentioned, a paper ballot is really the ultimate and most secure way we can do it. It's just, as with everything else in the world, it's a trade-off. We can make it fast, we can make it easy, and we can make it secure, but generally not all three of those things at the same time. So while it may seem complicated and difficult and unnecessarily archaic, our system, all the way up to the Electoral College and all the way down to the little, county clerk in Hinsdale County, where there's like 600 total voters, all of those things make our system difficult, but also resilient from the sort of hacking that we have experienced in some other places. I mean, maybe we'll get to the point where we can have a fully digital election, and I'm sure Dan and Trevor can speak to that, but there are advantages to our system being as slow as it is.
Thank you, Vincent. I think that's a really good point about the important role that humans play in this. Sometimes we think about it as technology completely separate from the human experience, and we don't necessarily see all of the people who've processed all of the ballots year after year, but that we can have some trust in the fact that there are many, many people who are working specifically to make sure that this is a fair process. And this is time to turn to Dan to talk about these software and technology. So Dan, do you have to make about that?
Sure, you were kind of
and your mute is on. I think you're still muted, Dan.
So you were kind of cutting out there, but I think you were going to try to turn that over to me,
Oh.
if I understood right.
Oh. Sorry, yes, I was, Dan.
Um,
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I was just mentioning that I think the electronic voting is a good question, and that actually it does also remind us of the role that humans have, both in counting the ballots right now as well as in creating the technology. You know, that, and I don't think we've necessarily talked about that in this setting, but I
right.
know that's something that you look at too, is the issue of bias that goes into the creation of any kind of technologies we have, and what kinds of checks there are about that. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this issue of electronic voting. How do you feel about it? Is it something we're going to move toward or not?
Yeah, actually, it's kind of funny. We when we were originally planning out this webinar, we had talked about if we want to discuss future of voting at the same time. We've actually maybe are going to be doing a separate webinar, kind of to deep dive into that topic going forward. But briefly, what I would say is, as a computer scientist, we're naturally rather skeptical of software solutions to do things like this, just because we know how software is written, and it can be rather hard to trust it sometimes, especially for something as important as counting an election. That being said, I think there's a couple of things we can aspire to if we wanted to move to an entire electronic-based election system. Transparency and auditability would be critical in a system like that. I would want the system to be open sourced. I would want us to have a common system at a federal level that we could have states adopt, right? I'd want this to have some both government involvement and maybe a private company involvement too, right? But it would be important that we'd understand the software. When I say open source, I'd want to be able to see how the software is written, right? I'd want it to be able to look at the source code for it. I'd want to be able to see, that it's doing what it says it's doing. We'd have to have some sort of auditability, and that'd probably be like a paper trail, right? Even if they vote electronically, we'd probably still want to have some way for a person to validate that their vote was counted as they expect it to be, and that we have some sort of paper fallback that we could look to that corresponds to their vote. I was actually researching this a little bit in preparation for this today, and I actually stumbled on this product from Microsoft called Election Guard, which is interesting. They actually are trying to tackle, I think, this exact issue with the creation of Election Guard, which is you get a card when you walk in, and you put it into the voting machine, and it encrypts your vote right there when you make it on the tablet. And it can optionally print out a piece of paper as your ballot once you finish voting on the tablet, right? And I think they are trying to exactly solve this issue of transparency and auditability. They've open sourced their application. It's completely out there for people to see. They're starting to do some, small scale elections with it. And it was rather interesting to research and look into. And I think that kind of thing would certainly be our future. Now, this is still a person going in person and voting. This isn't logging onto a website and voting, right? That at least what they were doing. You can imagine the future of the world where you're going to a website from home with a code you were given to go vote. And I think, to me, when we discussed, Cassia and I, before this kind of idea, to me, I think it's important that I can get parity of accountability, that yes, I know it's you that voted, with right now you sign your ballot when you send it in. And, Trevor spoke to the fact that that's signature is validated and we know it's you that made that vote. I would want to be able to keep that same level of accountability, to know that it is you that's voting, if you're doing it from home. And I think that would be, to me, the challenge, is making sure that I know we still have that same level of faith in the outcome of the election, to know that it is this person that voted or this person that's voted. Right now, yeah, we can send out mail-in ballots to everyone, but they still have to send it back signed, and the signature still has to be signed on file. It isn't enough for me to just give a code in the mail, right? I'd have to know it's you using that code. And I think these are the kind of challenges we'd have to look at to be able to just let you vote from home. Anyway, that's what I'm sure other people can chime in. We can continue the conversation, but I'll start it there.
I had my mute button on there. This is just always a reminder that we're in the Zoom realm, right? So yeah, thank you, Dan. And I think that you raise a lot of really good points about how we're really not really there yet to be able to vote from home, and we really wouldn't want to do that at this point. And we do have a robust system that's been developed over a long period of time, and so this is really helpful, I hope, in people who are watching it. And I again want to encourage those of you who are are participating by watching the webinar, if you do have some specific questions or particular questions that you'd like to raise to Trevor, the Colorado Secretary of State's office, if you have other people that you'd like to hear from in relation to these particular issues, this is a great time to ask, and you can just use that Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll be sure to highlight them. One of the things that I guess I have a question about is, I was actually just I was following the story about Alex Gibney, who is a person who's just recently released a new documentary, but he had released a documentary about a month ago called Agents of Chaos, which was about a very careful tracing of what had happened in the 2016 election and the role that Russian leadership played in trying to foster different kinds of means of just creating distrust, as we've been talking about before, and how social media had been leveraged in that process. And so I guess I'm kind of curious about what's going on with that. If there are some things that people are seeing that you're concerned about, since you all have some expertise behind the scenes in what might be going on. If you can see some things that you want us to be looking out for and noticing as we go into these last couple of weeks. So I guess I wanted to see, Vincent, you wanted to say something a little bit about that, some things that the citizens might be, what we should be looking out for in the next couple of weeks, based on what we know now from 2016 especially.
Sure. I mean, predicting the future is always fraught with peril, but it passed as prologue. What Russian, and not just Russian, really anybody who wishes us ill, is trying to do is really twofold. One, as Dan has mentioned earlier, they're trying to make us distrust the elections. But two, they're trying to speak to their own people as much as they're trying to speak to us. So the Russian people, Chinese, people aren't stupid. They know they live in an unfree society. They know the government doesn't represent their views. But what the fundamental trade that people like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping have made with their people is, look, democracy is messy. Democracy will result in instability, and we're giving you, a better life. So what they want their people to see is, riots in the streets. They want to see protests. They want to see people arguing that American democracy is fundamentally unfair, because what they want to be able to do is point to their own people and say, look, you can be chaos or stability. We're the agents of stability. So in that vein, what they're trying to do is trying to get us as riled up as possible. As Dan has spoken to, and I'm sure Cassie and others could talk to as well, a lot of what they did in 2016 was create competing events to try and gin up angry people no matter what the side. So for instance, they would make a fake Black Lives Matter rally and then make a fake counter rally to that, and then invite real people, and real people would show up and have a screaming match in the middle of the public square, not knowing that the impetus for it was created by people who want to do us harm. So if it passes prologue, we could see stuff like that again. I'd imagine a lot of people, some rather unusual fake Facebook stuff about, boosting particular disinformation instead of, so very briefly, misinformation is information that is wrong. For instance, saying like Boulder is the capital of Colorado. Disinformation is information that is wrong, but deliberately designed to provoke a negative response amongst us. So I expect a lot of disinformation, particularly about winning or losing particular states, depending on who. If Biden wins, I imagine a lot of stuff about how Trump was robbed, and if Trump wins, I imagine a lot of stuff about how Biden was robbed. So as long as we just calm down a little bit and do a bit more homework before getting mad, you might be okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember early days noticing someone on my Twitter feed had said, if something comes across your feed, whether it's about, for instance, Kanye West or Ice Cube, for instance, that have been in the news recently, think about who might want you to see that, and whether there's some benefit behind that, that may be kind of a good barometer for us to be thinking about. Not that things do become viral often just organically, but there also can be factors behind the scenes that are also pushing certain stories to the front to complicate the issues a little bit more. And that's actually what we know happened with relation to the Russian troll farms in 2016. I'm wondering, Trevor, if specific, we're talking about the national landscape, but are there some issues that we to is and because we are have people from a variety of different backgrounds who are here. Trevor, do you have some thoughts about this issue of misinformation and disinformation?
Absolutely. So actually, I mean, and Vincent kind of hit the nail on the head. What we saw in 2016 is obviously we saw efforts to compromise email accounts of candidates and campaigns and whatnot. We do know that Russia, through the Internet Research Agency, they were actively trying to at least poke and prod at voter registration systems and election night reporting systems. We know that. What we also know was very effective from reading the Southern District of New York indictment, reading the Mueller reports, reading all of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence reports. We know that they were trying to inflame public opinion, sow division amongst Americans, keeping us fighting amongst ourselves, which, you know, from their perspective as a global power, it probably makes them easier to do other things while we're paying attention to our own little divisions. Vincent just hit the nail right on the head there. What we're doing this cycle is, so there's been a ton of energy around this. There's a nonprofit organization, the Elections Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center. It's organized under the Department of Homeland Security, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, and they've worked with the Stanford Internet Observatory and worked with Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Google, Microsoft to try to build up more resilience around identifying foreign influence operations. It can be a little bit of a tricky area because we need to make sure that we're looking at foreign influence operations, and because you know, First Amendment rights of U.S. residents, you know, they're inviolate, right? We don't want to stomp on that. But if we do see, as we did in 2016, as we did in 2018, as Ukraine saw in their elections, as has been seen globally, when we see foreign powers trying to amplify and promote those sorts of stories, you know, that's where we think that it crosses the line. And so our office, we actually brought in, we stood up a new unit just this year, really focused on misinformation and disinformation, identifying it, and then trying to refer people to trusted sources. We're not trying to give you know, those bad actors a platform by reiterating their messages, but when we see those messages and those themes, we're trying to provide counter information to give the truth. And so that's one of the things we've actually put a lot of focus in on. We actually brought in some folks who have experience on the counterterrorism side, because that's also an area that is ripe for you know, those kinds of operations on the terrorists and counterterrorism. And so we've brought in some folks with great experience to help us to assist with that.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Trevor. And we have a question that's really specific to you two that came in as you were speaking. And this is from Oscar Pachon Herrera. And he asks, what's the criteria to reject an absentee ballot based on signature mismatching? What is the accurate test that the signature must pass to not reject the ballot? And if a voter gets a rejected ballot due to signature discrepancy, does the voter have a chance to fix the signature? And so he's asking about that in relation to, you know, Colorado, the deadlines coming up and that sort of thing. So if you could help us with that, that would be great.
Fantastic question. I'm glad you asked. So in Colorado is one of the states. We actually have a guidebook that we provide to election officials on how they do that sort of signature comparison, because you'll notice, you know, maybe you've already turned your ballot in, or maybe you have yet to vote in the election this year. You'll mark your ballot, you'll fold it up, you'll stuff it in an envelope, and then on the outside of that envelope, it'll have your name on it. You know, on the return envelope, obviously the outer envelope was addressed to you. The return envelope also has your name on it, and it has a barcode, and it's got a signature block, so where you will sign. So when the ballot is received back by the election official, the first thing they do is they will, and larger counties use electronic systems to do this sort of initial comparison. But every county does this with every single ballot. They will check to make sure that the ballot came back from that person, and that signature that's on the outside of the envelope actually looks like a signature they've seen from you before. And if there's any discrepancy, if it doesn't look like the same signature, it will get outstacked, okay? And at that point, it gets reviewed by a bipartisan team of judges, an R and a D, and an election official who are looking at it to say, does that look like John's signature? I'm not sure that's John's signature. Now, if they both look at it and they say, that looks like John's signature. And we collect all those signatures over the course of time because people's handwriting changes over the span of time. And so they can look not only at the most recent thing that you signed when you went and voted in person, or when you requested a mail ballot, or you responded to an information card, a change of address. So they've got this history of signatures to look at. And if there's a discrepancy, then the election official will contact you. They'll say, you know what? We're not sure this is your signature. We need you to verify that this is your signature. They'll reach out to you as an individual and say, this looks discrepant. We need to resolve this. And that doesn't have to happen by election day, right? Under state law, we've got several days after election day to resolve discrepancies on mail ballots that came in even on election day. For mail ballots that have already come in, counties today are reaching out to voters where they believe there's a discrepancy. And again, it's a bipartisan reviewed process because we do want to make sure that every single eligible voter does have a chance to have their vote counted.
Thank you very much, Trevor. And I think that's really the takeaway message from everybody, is that we all want to have our votes counted, and we all want to be able to encourage everybody to get out and actually vote. We are 3 minutes over, but I wanted to just let everybody know that I would really love to hear one takeaway from each of our panelists. This has been a really interesting conversation, and we have a group with such different expertise that I'm going to give you an opportunity to just tell us all one sentence that you'd like to make sure that we keep in mind in these next 19 days as we're leading up to this election, and perhaps for the several weeks or months afterwards. But I just would like to give you, again, one more time, just one sentence. We'll go around and give us your takeaway that we can keep in mind as we're facing the next couple of weeks. So Dan, I'll start with you.
Okay, great. My takeaway, I think it's kind of a recap of what we've talked about all throughout this, is when you are presented with information, take a moment to consider where it's coming from. Take a moment to think about, why was I sent this? So I think it was a great thing to bring up. Is this something, I saw it on social media, can I verify it? Take that extra time, it's worth it, to try to validate this information. Don't just accept it, right? Because there are people out there trying to do harm, and it's really easy on social media to spread misinformation. So just take that moment for yourself and decide if this is a real thing. Do the research, do the homework. It's worth it, especially on something as important as our elections, right? And even if there is some chaos, know that, as Trevor has so nicely told us about, there are good controls in place to make sure that your ballot is being counted and is being certified correctly. And know that it may take us a couple minutes to get there, but the election that's certified can be trusted, right? Because there are good controls in place. And as Vincent brought up too, right? We have a complex system, but in a lot of ways that complexity can be a good thing. And know that we are going to get to the right place, right? So that we can trust it. That's more than a sentence, sorry, but that's kind of where I'm coming from.
That's all right. Thanks, Dan. We really appreciate your words. Cassia, how about you? Would you like to leave us with some words of wisdom?
If I can leave here with one word from today, just if you are ever planning anything, whether it's a caucus or a birthday party, vet the outside contractors you are using. Make sure you have done your research. Learn, okay, is this person capable of doing what I am asking them to do? That's so many issues can be avoided by that. And just if I can add one more thing, just make sure you vote.
Thank you, Cassia. Yes, and we really appreciate when we have grad students at University of Denver like Cassia who are developing this kind of expertise, and they can be those people that you call on when you need some additional technological support. David, I think you're up next. I hope David's still on the...
Yeah, I'm here.
There's David. Oh, good. Sorry, we lost David earlier.
Yeah, sorry about that. Actually, I have two takeaways. The first one is that the situation of the voting system in the US is not as tragic everywhere as some news media reports make it seem. And I think, Colorado is doing a pretty good job in terms of making voting accessible and secure. And as you were saying, hacking is very difficult. And so I think news media should also focus on the positive news about the electoral system, not just on the problems and the issues. And that might help reinforcing, trust in the democratic system. And when it comes to misinformation and the spread of misinformation, I think that everyone should play their part. And I think if we see some type of information, call it out, talk with your friends, talk with your family, talk with your grandparents and parents. We know that, seniors are the most likely to be influenced by social media misinformation, and try to explain why a news story is false and inaccurate. And we know that peer influence can be extremely effective. So, yeah.
Great, thank you, David. I appreciate those thoughts. It is very helpful for us to remember the role that we all play in this aspect of information and misinformation and correcting what's out there. Vincent, how about you? Would you like to leave us with some final thoughts?
Sure. We live in the longest continuous period of peaceful democratic transfers of power in human history. That's gone through an awful lot, and it's not going to be changed now, as long as all of us remain calm and do what we're supposed to do. Best preparations are made, everything's going to be fine. It's going to be messy, but everything's going to be fine.
Thank you. And Trevor, we're going to give you the last word. So what would you like to have us remember in these next few weeks?
Thanks for giving me the last word. We would encourage voters to be patient, prepared, and participatory. I stole that from someone at the federal level who mentioned that, you know what, in all of the information that we're receiving from sources, foreign and domestic, consider trusted sources. Don't believe everything you read, but actually try to verify it. And the reality is, vote. If you don't vote, those people who are trying to diminish confidence in our system, they've won. So get out and vote.
All right, thank you very much, Trevor. And this seems like a great time for us then to wrap up. And I want to thank our panelists again for all of their insights and for sharing their information with us today. And as a reminder, today's discussion was recorded and will be made available shortly after this event. And the university also will be hosting several other conversations related to the election between now and the next 19 days, as well as conversations about mental health and wellness and social justice and more topics that will be of interest. So we'll be planning a future webinar, as Dan mentioned earlier, on the elections of the future after this upcoming election when we have some more things to reflect on. So to find out about more events, please visit rsvp.du.edu. And again, thank you to all of you, and I wish you all a wonderful day.